Hi, I'm Zachary Hunter. Welcome to the Explain It to Me podcast. EITM Pod is about info without gatekeeping and encouraging curiosity, community, and education without drowning in jargon. This is part 4 of my miniseries about the X-Men. Today we're going to discuss key, mostly standalone stories, spin-off events, and also give you a guide to reading the most recent era of X-Men, 5 years known as the Krakoan Age. First, however, would you do me a favor? Given the algorithms, would you please like, rate, and subscribe to EITM Pod? I really appreciate the help in letting this show continue to grow. Okay, here's how this is going to go. I'm going to break this down into 2 parts. Pre-Krakoa, and then also some tips for reading the Krakoan books. I'm going to try to not repeat myself regarding events and stories I discussed in previous episodes. So those won't be a focus here, even though things like Age of Apocalypse can easily be read on their own and is somewhat a side story. Okay, let's start with the miniseries. Almost by definition, these fill in the gaps between main story issues and/or provide background information for certain characters. The Magic with a K miniseries I discussed last episode is a great example of this. But let's actually start with 1991's Weapon X. This is a Wolverine story told over parts in a serial format in a book called Marvel Comics Presents, issues 72 through 84. It was both written and illustrated by Barry Windsor Smith, whose other major X-Men work as an artist were the Storm-focused Life Death and Life Death 2 issues about when she lost her powers. Those are Uncanny X-Men 186 and 198, by the way. So, Weapon X, however, is not about one of the all-new, all-different members of the team of X-Men without their powers, unlike those issues, but rather it's about how one, this case Wolverine, got quote-unquote upgraded with an adamantium-covered skeleton and the problems that caused it. It should be said that this book is basically a slasher flick with a lot of body and psychological horror, so it definitely isn't for the kiddies. Okay, I would also suggest for a central miniseries, The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix from 1994, and its sequel 2 years later, The Further Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix. These minis are written by Scott Lobdell, with artist Gene Ha for the first one, and for Further Adventures, Peter Milligan writes, with John Paul Leon penciling. The First Adventures miniseries is set during the honeymoon of Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, and Jean Grey, aka Phoenix, also Marvel Gold, but Phoenix in this context. And it lets those two travel into the alternate future where their son Nathan Summers, aka Cable, was raised. This gives the newlyweds a chance to effectively raise the child they didn't get to see grow up, while also giving the reader, us, a chance to learn more about Cable's past in the distant future. There is a Askani son, Askani apostrophe S-O-N, as in son of Askani, mini by Lobdell and Ha, Scott Lobdell and Gene Ha, along with Jeff Loeb as an additional writer and plotter, that follows up on the Nathan/Cable story after the end of these adventures, but before we meet him in the final issues of New Mutants. However, the Further Adventures mini is actually probably more important, at least now in comics, as it shows a lot of Mr. Sinister's origins, especially his connection to Apocalypse and his obsession with the Grey and Summers families/bloodlines. Further Adventures is probably now essential reading, given how the Sins of Sinister and Fall of X storylines in the recent Krakoan Age, years later, shook out. The finale of Krakoa is directly tied to this miniseries, but more on that later. Because it isn't just about minis. Outside the core books, sometimes whole series are largely standalone as well. From both the main X books, or books, but also there are examples like the series Exiles, which is basically the show Sliders, Quantum Leap, and the movie The Dirty Dozen, but using X-Men characters or X-Men related characters across the multiverse. A bunch of the references it makes probably would be missed by new readers, but due to the cast being drawn from what if style universes and timelines, there is a nice level of independence that it might give readers a bit of insight into the main stories, such as Dark Phoenix Saga, through a sort of backdoor approach. Also, going forward, it has the Age of Apocalypse version of Blink, the version of Morph that is the most like the one in the cartoon, and also a host of other characters from across the multiverse that stand out and are memorable, sometimes more than their main universe equivalent. Similarly, like I mentioned in the last episode, there's the so-called X Factor Investigations run by Peter David. This consists of the Madrox miniseries, that's Madrox, as in Jamie Madrox, the so-called Multiple Man, and then all of X Factor Volume 3. This run, all told, lasted from 2004 through 2013. Issue-wise, that's the miniseries, plus X Factor issues 1 through 50 and 200 through 262. After issue 50, Volume 3 of Marvel switched to the original volume's issue count, aka, quote, legacy numbering, end quote, seemingly to juice sales. So Multiple Men, aka Madrox, aka Jamie, creates dupes, which are perfect copies of himself whenever he gets hit, bumps into things, and sometimes just by forcing it. These are independent people, but he can absorb them back, along with the duplicate's acquired memories. This leads to some fascinating, funny, and occasionally tragic storylines that are largely separate from the rest of the mutants and their occasional nonsense. This team of heroes / private detectives in this book consists largely of members of the former government-sponsored era of X Factor, a few Generation X members, and various other characters who had fallen through the cracks of the main X books. Another series I would suggest a deep dive into, if you want a more isolated story, but still important, is X-Men Legacy. Technically, Legacy was yet another rename of adjectiveless / new X-Men, similar to what I discussed in the last issue regarding Grant Morrison. But starting with issue 208, it became something rather different than just another X-Team book. Under writer Mike Carey, it became largely about a single character at a time. First, it dove deep into Charles Xavier, aka Professor X, and then at issue 226 through 275, it focused on the woman known as Rogue. Xavier and Rogue had both been having a rough go of it plot-wise. Professor X needing rehabbed into being a usable character, especially as a hero, following storylines like the controversial Deadly Genesis arc by Ed Brubaker. I won't get into that, but Xavier being the focus of Legacy improved his legacy and made him a more useful character in years to come. During the Rogue-focused part of the run, there's also an event called the Age of X, which, other than a few crossover issues with New Mutants Volume 3 is an extremely self-contained and rather underrated story, because Age of Apocalypse, and even the far less beloved pre-Krakoan Age, Age of X-Men, tend to get much more attention. It is a alternate universe story in sort of a pocket way, so you can see the characters reveal themselves in a different light. Anyway, after Carey's run finished with the Rogue Focus storyline, Volume 2 of X-Men Legacy began under Simon, aka Cy, Spurrier. Except, instead of focusing on Rogue or even Professor Xavier, the focus was on David Haller, aka Legion, who is the son of the now recently dead Professor Xavier at the time. Don't worry, he got better. David/Legion was played on TV by Downton Abbey's Dan Stevens on the show Legion, with a version of the character very, very influenced by Spurrier's characterization of Haller, along with his earlier appearances, especially in New Mutants 25 through 28 under Chris Claremont. Legion is a troubled and incredibly powerful character. This run by Spurrier is likely as good as he has ever been written and might ever be. Due to David's distaste for costumes and superheroics, he largely keeps to himself in terms of the X-teams, but that doesn't mean these stories don't matter. Also, as for runs within the spin-offs, I really want to point out certain sections of Excalibur, as a lot of folks skip out on that series. You don't need to read Captain Britain beforehand, though some of it, especially the so-called Jasper's Warp, Jasper''S Warp, W-A-R-P, storyline written by Alan Moore, do establish the characters quite a bit. Moore wrote Captain Britain long before he became famous for books like Watchmen, V for Vendetta, and many others. But several themes in those books can be seen in his run on Captain Britain. However, unfortunately, it's hard to read in any sort of collected format, other than just buying the Captain Britain omnibus. Anyway, for Excalibur, from Excalibur Special Edition Volume 1, better known as The Sword is Drawn, through Excalibur issue 34, the series was mostly written by Claremont and drawn by a man named Alan Davis. Davis actually drew the Alan Moore era of Captain Britain, and Claremont gets credit for co-creating the title character. So Brian Braddock / Captain Britain being the heart of the team makes sense, as this book clearly is a labor of love for both Claremont and Davis. Indeed, after Claremont left the book, Davis later returned to both write and draw the comic from issue 42 through 67. And in my opinion, this is the height of the series. Indeed, what comes afterwards is very much, quote, just another X book, end quote, and not the goofy, epic, soap opera-y, cosmic, and yet very British comic it was under Claremont and Davis. If you see my videos on Doctor Who, you'll see why I think that this is worth checking out. And with all due respect to Warren Ellis and Ben Robb, who read the book later on, if you're going to read Excalibur, it's the Davis run you should focus on. Davis, however, picks up loose threads of Claremont, so they very much are two sides of the same coin, and I suggest reading both. Those are a much shorter series called Generation Hope, as opposed to Generation X. And it, especially the first 12 issues by Kieran Gillen, Gillen, is also worth checking out. That book, that first year of it, sets up stuff for Gillen's various series that he wrote at the end of the Krakoan Age. like Immortal X-Men and X-Men Forever. Plus, it lets you get to know Hope Summers, who I mentioned briefly um, in the past episode. She is also known as Cable's daughter. She's also known as the Mutant Messiah. And it lets you get a chance to know her without all of the crossover slash big event nonsense of Messiah Complex, Messiah War, and the third in the trilogy, X-Men Second Coming. Those events are big deals for the X-Men. They're set after the Decimation M-Day storyline where mutants are largely depowered. But Hope's a baby or a little girl in them, and she's much more a plot device than a person. Indeed, her story slash plot seemed largely resolved in the comics event Avengers vs. X-Men, also known as AVX. But stories from the late 2023, almost 10 years after that event, and the first half of 2024 made it clear that that story wasn't the end of Hope's importance. Also, speaking of redheads connected to the Summers family, while it does have a lot of characters who aren't well known, and also Cassandra Nova from Grant Morrison's run, the X-Men Red series about Jean Grey from 2018 might actually be fun for you, along with the Jean Grey series about the time-displaced '05 version of her that preceded it in 2017. Altogether, these two books paint a vision of Jean Grey, both teenage and grown up and recently back from the dead versions, finding herself slash showing a way forward, which makes you see the 60s stuff, the Grant Morrison era, and the Krakoan era that followed these runs in a new way. A way you see the telekinetic, telepathic woman who's been called both Marvel Girl and Phoenix in a new light. Then there's also issues of specific arcs within an ongoing series. And if you want the best arc of any of the spin-offs, I humbly suggest it is New Mutants issues 18 through 20, aka The Demon Bear. Written by Chris Claremont with art by the amazing Bill Sienkiewicz. That's Sienkiewicz. This is when New Mutants really peaks, as right afterwards there's the original Legion stories. And just overall, this is the period when that book, New Mutants, is firing on all cylinders. Another popular arc I wanted to mention is the Dark Angel saga from the very popular run by Rick Remender, Remender, his run on Uncanny X-Force, specifically issues 10 through 18. That's the Dark Angel saga. This is during the era that X-Force is very much a mutant kill squad. But not like in the CIA way, but a private army. And it does expect a basic level of knowledge of the Age of Apocalypse that might not be for everyone, or might not be a good first step. I should also mention some one-shots or side stories. A particularly beautiful one that really is a great character study as well is Havoc and Wolverine Melt Down. The art is fantastic. And if you want something that's very standalone, but became very influential much later on, if you can find it, I think it's on Marvel Unlimited, Fallen Angels, specifically Volume 1 of that title, as Volume 2 is a unrelated miniseries that launched during the Krakoan era, the beginning of it, and the less said about that book, the better. Also, there are a few Magneto stories that I just gotta suggest as well. First, Magneto Testament, which is in many ways far more a story about the Holocaust than it is about superheroes. Also, later on, the 2014 through 2015 Magneto series, written by Cullen Bunn. Cullen spelled Cullen, Bunn is spelled Bunn. This series is technically volume 3 of Magneto, but you don't have to read the other volumes. And while I haven't revisited since I read it, I recall it is a fascinating look at a complicated character who I have great affection for, and also very much a solo book, even in the way Mike Carey's run on X-Men Legacy wasn't always, such as Rogue and the Age of X period. Finally, no mention of self-contained stories in the spin-offs could miss a single issue. X Factor Volume 1, number 87, aka X Aminations, X-Aminations. This is from the government-sponsored team era of X Factor and is set right after the Executioner's Song event that I mentioned last episode. So early 90s, early to mid. It's written by Peter David, and it gets into the minds of the team in such a unique way that even just in the case of Quicksilver, aka the Scarlet Witch's brother and basically Magneto's son, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson in the Avengers movies, he has never been written as well or as memorably as he was in this issue. There's actually a sequel issue during the X Factor Investigations era in Volume 3, specifically issue number 13. So if you're checking out that series, as I suggested you would, it might be a good idea to backtrack and read that issue. Okay. So we did the pre-Krakoa stuff. Now let's head to the giant living island of Krakoa and what the X-Men and the Mutants were up to between July of 2019 and June of 2024. It all starts with the House of X and the powers of 10. 10 in this case is written in Roman numerals because X and 10 are the same. See, this joke, it should be said, seems to go back to Grant Morrison's new X-Men run, where Wolverine is revealed to not really be Weapon X, but Weapon 10. Jonathan Hickman and the rest of the Krakoan era writers use this double meaning of sorts a lot, especially in crossover events, as you'll see. These two series, House and Powers for short, sets up that all mutants, good, evil, and the non-aligned civilians, now have a homeland on the island of Krakoa, which was previously the setting slash antagonist in the giant-sized X-Men #1 story, when the all-new, all-different era started. Also, a key part of this is the X-Men basically solve death, so mutants can be resurrected, which obviously changes the stakes of stories quite a bit. Comic book deaths are a thing in that they're usually reversible, but never quite so clear and explicit and rapid as it is here. This event, House and Powers, because the two series are interlinked, led to 4 periods before the Krakoan Age ended, and the new, quote, From the Ashes era launched in July of 2024. Not to be confused with From the Ashes as a storyline, which was mentioned last week as a Claremont story. The Krakoan Age's 4 periods are Dawn of X, Reign of X, Destiny of X, and finally, Fall of X. Dawn of X ended with the franchise-wide 22-part event 10 of Swords, written as X of Swords. Before that, however, 9 original series had launched, plus that second volume of Fallen Angels, Two of these series, X-Force and Wolverine, both written by Benjamin Percy, ran the entire length of the Krakoan era, some 50 issues. But others didn't last nearly that long. Under this run, this era, the main X-Men book serves more as glue for the other series, as Jonathan Hickman, the writer, wrote it to help develop the ideas that he had brought up in House of X and Powers of 10. Then the Reign of X, Reign to be clear, Reign of X, that spun out of the Ten of Swords epic, focuses on the first Hellfire Club Gala in 2021 and ends with 3 miniseries, Inferno, and then 2 interlocking ones, X Lives of Wolverine and X Deaths of Wolverine. I do not know if those are X or 10 in this context. I think it's 10 Lives of Wolverine and X Deaths. But those miniseries, unless you're following Benjamin Percy's Wolverine run, there's not a lot there in those 2 minis. But Inferno was Jonathan Hickman's departure from the franchise so far. And it was his run with the miniseries of House and Powers that helped reinvigorate X-Men as a franchise. So it is a must-read. Some other stories of note that launched during the Reign of X era are Sword, Volume 2, by Al Ewing. SWORD is an acronym there, so if you're looking for it, it'll be S.W.O.R.D. And it's Volume 2. It's important. Also, the main title, X-Men, relaunched after 21 issues under Hickman to start the Volume 6 of X-Men under Gerry Duggan. Gerry spelled Gerry. That run of X-Men would run until the end of the Krakoan Age. So 21 under Hickman, serving as glue, and then team book under Gerry Duggan. Duggan wrote it far more as a traditional team book than Hickman did because the team was set at that Hellfire Gala. So there was a difference in what the book was doing. Finally, there are 2 minis that matter if you're interested in reading the related stories and related series. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole and read Cy Spurrier's various Nightcrawler series, it starts with Way of X. And I should add that Jonathan Hickman's X-Men, the X-Men Volume 5, number 7, would most likely be required to be read as a prologue because it establishes why Nightcrawler is trying to do what he's trying to do in Way of X. After that miniseries ended, there's also a one-shot, single issue called Onslaught Revelation, or The Onslaught Revelation, I believe, that follows Way of X and goes into Legion of X, which starts in the next era, the Destiny of X era. Likewise, whether or not you're interested in reading Leah Williams' X Factor, by the way, this is X Factor Volume 4, if you're following along. In that era, the team investigates mysterious deaths in connection with the resurrection technology. Clones, is someone actually dead so they don't resurrect somebody before they should be, that sort of thing. Regardless of wanting to read that run, which is a very interesting book, Williams's X Factor team ends largely with the first Hellfire Club Gala back in 2021, and then a miniseries she wrote called Trial of Magneto. This Trial miniseries is important not just to Magneto and Scarlet Witch's relationship. In 2 episodes ago, when I referenced the change in the relationship, this is part of that. There's the issue of Sword. There's the trial of Magneto, and then her ongoing storylines. It also sets up, besides just regarding what happens with Scarlet Witch, which is important, what the Gauntlet also generally sets up is the Mars-based X-Men Red book that we'll get into in a moment. See, now we are in the Destiny of X era. And immortal X-Men, immortal because they can be resurrected and not die, by Kieran Gillen, launches here. And it is essential reading to fully understand what will happen in Fall of X. So this is in the third quarter, and it's setting up what will happen in the fourth. X-Men Red, under Al Ewing, is in some ways a sequel to his Sword run that I mentioned before, but it's also very much its own thing, and not just because it's set on a different planet. It also has a lot to do with Magneto, and also Storm. Their relationship matters a lot, as when we'll get to later. Now, if you read Tini Howard's, Tini Tini Howard's Excalibur run, which actually launched back in the Dawn of X era, if you want to hang in there, you'll need to read both the Knights of X, Knights with a K, and Betsy Braddock Captain Britain miniseries that are its sequels. So, also, there's a bonus for reading Howard's Excalibur run, as it makes Ten of Swords, which she largely co-plotted with Jonathan Hickman, a lot more fulfilling, and it connects back to the Claremont and Davis runs, which no one had really done in a long time, successfully. Also, speaking of miniseries, in this era, the Sabretooth one and its sequel, Sabretooth and the Exiles, both written by author Victor Lavelle, Lavelle, are fascinating, but definitely not for everyone. They are violent stories about prison and the possibility of redemption. Also, on a later note, there's X Terminators, X-Terminators, by Leah Williams. So this is after Trial of Magneto and X Factor. And it focuses and it involves a lot of female characters, such as the Laura Kinney Wolverine, Dazzler, Jubilee, who rarely get the spotlight or much of a chance to interact. Oh, and also there's vampires. They fight vampires, but like fun ones. But what really ends this Destiny of X era are the issues and miniseries associated with the terrific event, The Sins of Sinister. It largely stopped several of the books and changed them. So you'll see miniseries with similar names. Immortal X-Men becomes Immoral X-Men, for example. It is essential, and The Fall of X cannot be read without it, as far as I can tell. Now, speaking about this fall, while Pride usually comes before one, in this case, the era starts with the third Hellfire Gala in July of 2023. So 2021, 2022, and then 2023 is the third Hellfire Gala of the Krakoan Age. And this era ends with the interconnected fall of the House of X and rise of the Powers of 10. And also X-Men issue 35, which is also advertised as Uncanny X-Men 700, again using that legacy numbering that we saw in X Factor. There are two, quote, before the fall one-shots called Sons of X by Cy Spurrier, spinning out of both his Nightcrawler and his Legion runs. More of what Legion was up to with Nightcrawler, though. And also there's the Sinister Four by Kieran Gillen. And they're important. I would even say Sinister Four is essential. At least to fully get what's going on in Fall of X. But speaking of Spurrier's run, his Nightcrawler books, Way of X, The Onslaught of Revelation one-shot, and then I can't think of the X, Path of X, becomes a miniseries called Uncanny Spider-Man. There's also a one-shot called X-Men Blue, Origins, which slides in between issues 4 and 5 of the mini. So to recap, that's Way of X, Onslaught of X, Way of X, Onslaught Revelation, Legion of X, Uncanny Spider-Man 1 through 4, X-Men Blue Origins, and then Uncanny Spider-Man issue 5. Okay. Now, spinning out of what happens in the third Hellfire Gala, I won't say what it is, but there's a reason what happens afterward is called the Fall of X. There are a lot of miniseries. One such miniseries is Jean Grey, written by Weezy herself, Louise Simonson. There are, as well, 2 Ms. Marvel books, co-written by the actress who plays her on TV and in the movies, Iman Vellani. First is called Ms. Marvel, The Next Mutant, and then later there's Ms. Marvel, Mutant Menace. And above all, just because you want to know what happens in the main book, there's Al Ewing's Resurrection of Magneto, spinning out of Ewing's X-Men Red run, and, as I said, Magneto with the trial, but also his relationship with Storm that Ewing developed. These are both key character studies, and for both Jean Grey and Magneto, they really do advance the main plot. But as for the plot, you really need to read X-Men Forever, which goes alongside the main X-Men book of House of X and Rise of the Powers of 10. Those 2 event books, plus the main X-Men book, are important, obviously, but X-Men Forever resolves not just plots of Immortal X-Men that Gillen hadn't fully developed, or had developed but hadn't fully finished, but also it fills in what goes on between the pages of those main event books. And I know that's a lot. It is a crazy amount of comics. And even if you spring for Marvel Unlimited to get them all in a flat rate streaming subscription model, they're usually about 3 months behind, so by the time you would get to it, even X-Men 35 / Uncanny X-Men 700 would be there. It would take a long time to read it all. But what I'm trying to do, honestly, with this guide is save you dozens and maybe even hundreds of issues that you won't have to worry about. You don't have to read all these series. But if you follow along with some of the suggestions, you'll find books you like. You'll know the big events. You'll know what's being referenced. Okay. So that's a lot. I tried to minimize spoilers as best as possible. But overall, I think I gave you everything you would need pre-Krakoa to get the essential side and spin-off stories. And during Krakoa, either the core stories or at least the lay of the land. And that's not a reference to it being an island. So I hope it helps. Next episode, I hope will be a lot more casual. And also shorter. I want to share my thoughts and conclusions in a way that is clearly separate from the more objective info that I tried to provide in these 4 episodes. I also want to include some podcast and website suggestions in case you want more detailed information from other sources. So in the meantime, if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, I can be reached at eitmpod, eitmpod @gmail.com. And if you're willing to help the show monetarily, feel free to go to ko-fi.com/eitmpod. So until next time then, Stay safe out there. God bless. And thank you for your time.